So, in essence, my name's Gordon. I like mushrooms. I have a PhD in biochemistry. I went to UC Davis and got a whole background in sort of fermentation science stuff, and I looked at interactions between yeast and bacteria in wine fermentations and how that affected wine quality, which was doing sort of microbial ecology at the level of what's happening in a tank. And after graduating, I was in New Zealand for a little while and got really bored because I was supposed to be writing papers and I didn't want to. So I started going outside and I found hundreds of thousands of mushrooms and was like, oh my God, what is all this stuff? And it sort of reignited like a latent childhood interest that I'd had. And I took tons and tons of photos, and the next thing I knew, I started a mushroom-only Instagram, and that kind of spiraled out of control. And that was called Fascinated by Fungi, and then it became a YouTube, it became a Facebook, it became a TikTok, and now I have like 3 million followers. And I leveraged that large following into getting a book deal, because what I do online tends to be sort of like in-your-face, emotionally evocative, mushroom content. And there's education weaved in there, but there's also a fair bit of humor and things where you're just vying for people's attention, because that is the currency online, is can you get someone to watch a video for more than 3 seconds? So a lot of what I do is like tapping mushrooms, wiggling mushrooms, interacting with stuff in sort of a visceral way that people have an emotional reaction to it, because that's how you get clout online. But the point of doing that was to eventually get to be a point where I could like have a book that was the summation of all my experiences and everything I tried to learn about the fungal kingdom. And the point of this book is it's written, the first half is sort of a question-answer based format. So I don't expect anyone to like read this book cover to cover, but I do expect you to pick it up and look through it and get caught by the loads of photos, illustrations, and other kind of like accessible diagrams, because almost every single page in the book has some sort of visual element. So there's not big walls of text. There's a question and an answer, and you can get that, and it covers everything from kind of the basic biology of fungi, the ecology, evolution, reproduction. I go into the process of foraging for mushrooms, how to identify them, how to cook mushrooms. There's a biochemistry chapter where I talk all about the different toxins in mushrooms and medicines. And fungal intelligence, we discuss sort of like network intelligence, conservation, ethics, and then kind of like future fungal directions of like mycomaterials and mycoprotein, sustainability as food, all that kind of thing. So that's the first half of the book. Second half of the book is a bunch of mushroom profiles as well as fungi profiles. And what's different in this book compared to a lot of others, like I talked about, is it's at the genus level. So I don't talk about species specifically. I talk about things in this big categories of stuff. The edibles are graded sort of easy, medium, hard. Some of the easy ones are stuff like chanterelles are in there as easy. Technically, chanterelles are more of an intermediate, but everyone thinks the chanterelle is easy, so I put it there. Lobster mushrooms, puffballs, black trumpets are there in the easy ones. The medium ones are like a Coprinus comatus, the shaggy ink cap, honey mushrooms, almond-scented agarics, and the advanced stuff is stuff like morels, matsutake, edible amanitas, because as you get more into the advanced, you hit stuff that would either be harder to find or potentially has like deadly lookalikes. So they're sort of graded to help you approach things and start with easy, work your way to more difficult. The toxic mushroom section is graded by like threat level, so sort of like deadly stuff, dangerous stuff, and things to like beware of, because there's a tremendous number of toxic mushrooms that really don't present that much of a threat kind of thing, but you want to know about the ones that grow in your environment, specifically like the kinds of things your dog might eat. So I have a little section in the book about, mushrooms and dogs and how to like be safe with that. After the mushroom stuff, I spend a fair bit of time talking about like bird's nest fungi, stinkhorns, things that are sort of around in your like urban environment, and then also dye mushrooms. And I was really trying to cover like the entire spectrum of stuff. There is a section on entheogens, which is a polite way of saying psychedelics. It's a more inclusive term, and I find that psychedelics tends to be kind of a lightning rod thing that makes people like reject stuff sometimes, and so an entheogen is a little more encompassing term, and that's what I chose to use in my book. But I talk about psilocybe mushrooms as well as Amanita muscaria. That's on my pin. And then it goes into profiles on yeasts and various types of fungal pathogens and things that interact with plants. And that was, bringing my background as a microbiologist, as a biochemist. Oh, there we go. That's sort of working. Hooray! Okay. And the cool thing about my book that's different from any other book I've seen too is every single like page on mushrooms has, you know, somewhere between like 3 and 6 photos, but I'm limited by the size of what I can put in the book. And I think the hardest part about any book is you look and say, is this the thing? You're comparing the mushroom in your hand to the thing in the book. And if it's slightly older or slightly younger than the thing in the photo, or the color is different or the texture is different for whatever reason, you're really unsure. And so the best thing to do is to look at tons of other photos. And to that end, I have QR codes in the book that link you to iNaturalist, which is this phenomenal community science platform with thousands of photos. So you don't have to be dependent on, you know, the several photos of a chanterelle I have in the book. You can go and look online and see thousands more that help you actually really tell the difference. And iNaturalist, Alan talked about it, but basically it's a community science platform, so you upload a photo and then experts can come on and verify that you found what you think you found, kind of thing. So it's a lot of extra checks and it's a really good learning tool. Not to mention, I've heard a lot of people where they're like, oh yeah, I looked this up on Google Lens. I'm like, nope, stop, don't tell me anymore, because Google Lens is trash. The AI on iNaturalist is much better because it indexes on what's local. And that's a really important step for like helping make sure that you get the thing that is, you know, actually growing in your environment. Let's see if I can change my slides from up here. Oh, I can. Okay, neat. Hey, we're cooking with fire now. So yeah, if you don't know my social media accounts, I have like a whole ecosystem of content out there. And the whole point of me growing this was to get to the point of actually like writing a book and publishing it, which I did. Let me see if this plays. Will you play? Does this do the thing? Yeah, good point. Okay, so here's a little like view on my content. This is a St. Patrick's Day compilation. That's slime mold plasmodium. That's Hydnella peckiae. Those are chanterelles. That's a slime mold. That's a wiggly jelly fungi. That's a Piziza cup. Lichen. More slime mold. That's a slug eating a mushroom. Banana slugs. Parrot mushroom. That's another Hydnellum. This is Chlorociboria. That's a microheterotroph. Those are droplets. That's an ink cap, and these are puffballs. So that's like a 20-second compilation that's been viewed, I don't know, 40 million times kind of thing on Facebook. Some of my videos have so much watch time, it's absurd. I have a tap crunch video, which is basically like tap a mushroom and I yank it out of the ground. I do that for like a minute. There's a video of that on TikTok that has almost 50 million views, and in real time that equates to about 40 years worth of watch time, which is insane that I have a video that's been watched for longer than I've been alive, kind of thing. And again, the point of what I'm trying to do is draw people in with sort of a visual element and then trick them into actually learning something. So hopefully you guys are here to intentionally learn something, but if not, I'm gonna hit you with a fire hose of information anyhow, so good luck. There will be no test though, so don't worry about it. All right, I talked about this. Come on, go back. Nope. Well, it went for it. Okay, let's just talk about this. There you go. Fungi are not plants and they are not animals. They are their own distinct kingdom. And also, I've had this misunderstanding a few times. Recently, fungi are not bacteria either. Bacteria are a completely separate domain of life. They're much smaller. Fungi are in the same evolutionary lineage as plants and animals, but plants do photosynthesis, so they make energy from the sun. Animals and fungi are heterotrophic, which means they break stuff down to make energy. The big difference there between animals and fungi is that fungi digest externally. So they are chemically modifying their environment by, shooting out their digestive juices into the world around them, whereas animals have to physically consume something and eat it and digest it internally. So fungi act as what are called like ecosystem engineers. So if you guys think about like elephants on the savanna plain, they go through and mash up so much vegetation that they fundamentally change the composition of plants in the savanna because of them being there. And fungi are like that on a microscopic level, in that they're doing so much to change the world around them that they're sort of like determining who else can function in that space. And I'll show a graphic to that in a second. In essence, their fungi are often sort of this filamentous growth, little cells called hyphae that make this sort of mycelium stuff in the soil. Some of them produce mushrooms, some of them don't. Some of them complex with algae and make stuff like lichens, which is a great example of symbiosis. There are animals that partner very closely with plants, with with fungi, like the leafcutter ants, and those things will go out, harvest a tremendous amount of plant matter, bring it back to their den. There's a fungus that they cultivate and farm. It eats the plant matter, then they eat the fungus, and they're wholly dependent on each other because that fungus can't really reproduce without the ants, and the ants can't live without the fungus. Humans have been exploring the world of fungi for a long time. There's me being really excited about an Amanita muscaria. I will say that I think in the thousands of years of humans interacting with mushrooms, at no point have we like hunted something to extinction. So human foraging practices are sort of one of those inherently sustainable things that have been going on through, like since the dawn of history. And there's a lot of passed down knowledge about mushrooms that's out there, but there's still sort of a lack of common knowledge about like what things are. And you constantly hear people are like afraid to go mushroom hunting because they're, oh, I'm going to get poisoned. And it's not really that big a deal as long as you stick with sort of the basic guidelines about, easy to forage things. And I included orcas because they hate billionaires like I do. So that's why they're in there. Plants also do a lot of partnering with fungi, but we'll talk about that in a second. Okay. Come on. You want to change the slide for me? Since it's like barely working. There we go. Okay, so there's 5 basic forms of fungi. This is not a perfect guide, but this is kind of the brute force thing I put stuff into for my book. You have molds, which are filamentous, but they do not form mushrooms. An example of this would be something like rhizopus, which is common in like a compost thing, or the black bread mold. Anyone here ever eaten tempeh before? So tempeh is fermented with rhizopus. You have lichens, like I talked about, a symbiosis between a fungal, what's called a mycobiont, and a photobiont, something that's doing photosynthesis. Within a lichen, you also have a whole like ecosystem of other fungi and bacteria and things that make it sort of a whole holoorganism, they're really cool. Yeast are single-celled fungi that don't form filaments, and they do fermentation, so alcoholic beverages are produced by yeast, same with bread. There is aquatic fungi, aquatic parasitoids. That's sort of the basal fungal lineage that all fungi evolved from, little swimmy things in the water. And then we have mushrooms, which are the charismatic, filamentous ones that do form sort of distinct fruiting bodies. And so there's 5 basic forms. But one of the things I want to point out to you guys is there are fungi that can transition between those forms. So there's mushrooms that can have a yeast form and a mushroom form. There's things that can have like a mold form and a mushroom form, or there's even things that are both a lichen and a mushroom at different phases in their life. So there's this transitional thing, and I'll talk about that in a moment, just to kind of like, that's what really blew my mind as I started learning more about how large and encompassing the fungal kingdom is.
How do truffles fit in?
So truffles, and this is a good question. Truffles, as we know them, right, are this thing you shave on top of pasta and are very expensive. And the truffles we think of are tubers, and those are in Ascomycota. So there's 2, I'm gonna show you, this is a cool like fungal tree of life. Down here at the basal part are these aquatic parasitoids. And then over on the sides are some of the molds, what are called zygomycetes fungi. And then they split off into Basidiomycota and Ascomycota. So Basidiomycota is most of the things we know as mushrooms, guild mushrooms, polypores, jellies. And Ascomycota is more of the weird stuff like cups, truffles, morels, cordyceps. But the thing about truffles is they're not a genetic category. What we know is tuber is related to morels, and they're just morels that essentially went underground and got stinky. But truffles is a lifestyle. Every single major mushroom family, including everything in Basidiomycota, has a truffle form because it's a useful life strategy. So there's thousands upon thousands of species of truffles that are basically undiscovered because they are underground. And the only time that they really get seen is when an animal digs them up or smell them, because that is the evolutionary strategy. If you live your life underground, you cannot depend on the wind to help spread your spores. So instead you evolve to be really smelly. And that's basically what the truffle lifestyle is. And then stinkhorns are things that became truffles underground, but then re-emerged from being underground to be above ground mushrooms again. But that's why stinkhorns smell so much too. So there you go. Can I get a slide change? Thank you. Okay, so here's a big question, and this is like in the first chapter of the book, is like, where are fungi and what do they do? Because this is sort of one of the most fundamental questions. And the big thing is fungi are everywhere. We associate them with being, in concert with trees and in forests, and they're there. They're associated with the roots as mycorrhizae. They're there degrading like dead plant material. They're also inside of trees and plants as endophytes. That means they're living between plant cells. They're on the surface of them, living as epiphytes. They are potentially doing some plant-to-plant communication, although we're sort of pulling back on that idea a little bit. There are fungi that attack insects. They're called entomopathogens, so stuff like cordyceps. We have fungi all over our skin. We're all covered in a yeast called Malassezia, and there's like 10 million yeast living on your scalp right now. When you have an overgrowth of that, that is dandruff. When you've ever seen the skin lightning disease that happened to like Michael Jackson, that's an overgrowth of your skin yeast as well. There are a whole bunch of really important digestive fungi that are in ruminants and birds and reptiles, and those sort of live obligate in the guts of those animals, but those are fungi. There's fungi in water. One of the things that really blew my mind was how much diversity of fungi is in every single aquatic ecosystem on Earth, and we just didn't know about them. They're not there in super high amounts, but the roles they play might be really fundamental to nutrient cycling, especially in places like the deep ocean, in the middle of the pelagic water column, salt marshes, anywhere we go and test, we find new fungi. And that's one of the crazy things is only about estimated like 5 to 10% of all fungi have been described. And that's based on the fact that when we go sequence a new piece of soil or water from anywhere on the planet, we find a whole bunch of new things that have never been looked at. That being said, I don't think there's like millions of new mushroom species that haven't been discovered, but there are tons and tons of microfungi that we haven't really identified yet. Because again, they're everywhere. There's even things called endoliths. There's sort of lichens that live like inside of rock and can live for like 10 million or 10,000 years like inside of a rock. And like lichens that can survive the vacuum of space. So like fungi are all over our planet and present in every single ecosystem. And if they're there, they're probably impacting that ecosystem as well. So I usually say that fungi, you might have heard the phrase like mushrooms will save the world. And I push back on that because we're already living in a mushroom world. In fact, the world, like fungi is the glue that kind of holds our entire world together to some degree. In a very literal sense too, because it is the mycelium in soil that gives soil structure. It prevents it from just blowing away. And the fact that mycelium's there then enables all the other bacteria and other organisms to kind of do their thing. Which is important when you think about carbon and nitrogen cycling, because fungi are there to help enable the nutrients to be accessed by everyone else. They're working to just break stuff down and make things bioavailable. And there's a division of labor there between the bacteria and the fungi. The fungi tend to prefer complex carbohydrates, i.e. plant material, whereas bacteria tend to eat things that are more proteinaceous, so there's a lot more protein. So if you have a dead body decaying, it's probably mostly going to be eaten by bacteria and animals, whereas if you have a dead tree decomposing, it's probably mostly being eaten by fungi. And that's true sort of worldwide. There are some fungi that like gravitate towards dead bodies because it's a good source of nitrogen, but really only as they're breaking down. So can I get a slide switch? Thank you. Okay, so this always comes up, right? There's a certain mushroom person out there who was always like, oh, fungi are from outer space. And that sounds like something you'd come up with if you were on a lot of mushrooms. And it's a really fun idea if you're tripping. But when you look at the evolutionary evidence and the science, it says that fungi evolved here on Earth along with everything else. And this is a cool figure from my book because I was sort of looking at the evolutionary history of fungi, and it parallels that of plants. The way that this worked is about 2.2 billion years ago, an archaea swallowed a bacteria. From that arose eukarya. From that eukaryotic last common ancestor, plants diverged about 1.5, 1.7 billion years ago, and then animals and fungi diverged about 1 billion years ago. And you guys, who's heard that like fungi and animals are closer to each other than they are to plants? Yeah, that is technically true, but there's still been 1 billion years worth of evolution between fungi and animals, and I think that's a really important point too, because fungi and animals are quite fundamentally different from each other. But the point is that everything has been evolving in parallel, so there's been lots and lots of interactions happening throughout the history of life. And really what you see is sort of like fungi were swimming things in the water, then they came to land and lost their flagella. Then they started developing sort of this mycelial-like growth, the little filamentous networks. About 400 million years ago, lichens started showing up, but we didn't have mushrooms yet. Then we had the advent of both ascos and basidios, which are more complex forms of fungi they are the ones that produce mushrooms, so we care about them. But it really wasn't until, I think like the oldest fossils of mushrooms we have are about 150 million, 120 million years ago, because mushrooms don't fossilize the way that animals do. They don't fall into a bog and get preserved in stone, they just rot away, right? How many mushrooms have you seen last longer than a week or two? So there is evidence of a really cool mushroom that was preserved in amber from about 120 million years ago, and it looks a lot like a guild mushroom. But a lot of the current diversity of mushrooms didn't really start showing up until maybe 100 million or even 50 million years ago. And that went hand in hand with the advent of flowering plants. And so there's been lots of sort of leaps and bounds in evolution happening, and a lot of the sort of accelerated periods of fungal evolution in particular went hand in hand with giant die-offs. And so you'd have, an asteroid hit the Earth, tons of dead plant material. It's a bonanza for fungi to go eat. There was one really interesting thing, the origin of white rot fungi. So plants evolved a molecule called lignin. So they're composed of long chains of cellulose, and they're cross-linked by lignin. For about 100 million years, fungi didn't figure out how to break down lignin. It's a really complex molecule. So that period of time, what happened? All the plant material just piled up. That's where all of the petrochemicals on Earth come from. All the plastic, everything we get is from that period of time. So I think people don't realize that there's not more oil being made. So everything we're doing right now is taking that carbon out of the Earth and dumping it back on the surface. And guess what? Fungi are starting to break that down. And that's a really interesting thing. We have a guy here who knows a lot about microplastics. So if you want, you should talk to Scott about plastics. Anyhow, I just thought that was sort of a wild thing. There's this 100 million year period where fungi hadn't figured out the plant puzzle, and now plants are just piling up. And that's where all oil comes from, basically. But then they figured it out, and now white rot fungi are very good at breaking down plant matter. Slide change. Okay, so the fungal taxonomy is really complicated. I'm going to keep it really simple. This is kind of a classic diagram, and the ABCZs of fungi is still very relevant to what you need to know about the different categories. Chytrids are basically that aquatic parasitoid thing I was talking about. There's a kind of chytrid that, these are lots of very different lifestyles, but there's one out there that hunts algae, and its spores are essentially little harpoons that it shoots into an algae, and then it grows this kind of rhizoid growth into it, takes over the algae, hijacks it, makes a whole bunch of new harpoon-like spore cells, and they go out and hunt more algae. So these are the kinds of things that chytrids do. They tend to be aquatic parasitoids. Anyone ever heard of BD? It's a Batridiotractive, whatever. It's a chytrid that has killed about half of the amphibians on the planet. And it was moved around by humans moving animals around inappropriately. And it's killed tons of frogs, tons of salamanders, all sorts of stuff. So these tiny organisms can have really profound impacts on our world. This is also a lot of the unknown sort of fungal dark mass out there we're not sure of as could potentially be chytrids. Question?
Is that similar to how bacteriophages work?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, in that it goes into something, takes over,
Yeah, I didn't know if they masked it and then produced within it, or it just had it had whatever it affected produced. Is it how does that?
I can't speak to it too much because there's so much variation in chytrids. It's I was just bringing up the harpoon one as kind of an example of people don't normally think of fungi as something that would go hunt something else. But there's a lot of examples of chytrids that are actively tracking prey kind of thing, whether it's a small animal or a plankton or what. There's zygomycetes fungi, and so this is chytrids are in water, they came to land, and there was these sort of zygos that arose. This used to be called zygomycota, and it's been declassified because it's more complicated. Almost everything is more complicated. But zygomycetes these are the things that molds that form filaments but not long networks, and they don't make mushrooms. So I was talking about the rhizopus mold is a good example of this, or if you guys have ever heard of arbuscular mycorrhizae, these are the kinds of mycorrhizae that don't make mushrooms. Most plants have associated arbuscular mycorrhizae. Those are zygomycetes. And then in subkingdom Dickeria, we have Ascomycota and Basidiomycota, and this is what I was saying, but the ascos have cups, and their spores are packaged in little, almost looks like a little balloon just full of spores, but that's an ascus. And then the Basidiomycota has their spores in sort of a club-like structure, and that's called a basidia. So that's the primary difference there, is how the spores are packaged. But both of these can produce mushrooms, so we tend to care more about them. Can I get a slide change? Okay, so this is reproduction in fungi is simultaneously both really simple and really complicated. Because I can tell you, fungi reproduce by spore. The spore goes out, makes more of an organism, and boom, there you go. But within that, there's so many different strategies. Chytrids in particular are really complicated because they go through different life cycles where they have spores of different sizes and they have different hosts, this kind of stuff. But a lot of the really important thing to think about with fungi is they have both an asexual and a sexual cycle, and almost all fungi do some version of both things. Asexual life cycles allow you to really quickly double down on where you are right now and eat what's in front of you. Sexual life cycles are much more costly energetically, but they allow you to sort of adapt long term to the habitat and evolve over time. So a lot of asexual things are in what's called an anamorphic form, and a lot of those tend to be yeasts or molds. And then the teleomorphic form is often where they're actually forming a mushroom. Teleomorph is where you have two copies of a genome that are mating, versus the asexual form is just like it's sort of selfing itself, which is cool because humans can't do that, right? Our eggs and sperm do not live outside of our bodies, but fungi can exist as an anamorph. And a lot of yeasts are anamorphic, and a lot of the endophytes that live inside of plants are anamorphic. And then it's later on when they get together and they do sexual reproduction that they actually form a mushroom. So an example of this is witch's butter. You guys are familiar with these little orange jelly fungi. So in the teleomorphic form, it's a mushroom, and its anamorphic form is actually a yeast that can be parasitic in humans and cause disease. Which I think is really interesting because I spend a lot of time wiggling these things, if you guys have seen my content online, and so far I'm fine, but something to think about. And then fungi don't have true sexes. They have what are called mating types, sort of like a selection of genes, and they're swapping those. In yeast, it's really simple, because in yeast you have an A and an alpha, and they get together and go, oh, you got A, I got alpha, and then they shmoo together and create this cute little structure where they're mating. But yeast can also do a thing where they just self-mate themselves. So they produce a copy of themselves, and then it switches from A to alpha, and it's oh cool, I just made my own mate. Wouldn't that be nice? That's called homophalic. A lot of things are heterophalic and they can't do that, but yeast can. But it gets really complicated because yeast have an A and an alpha, but there's some things like Schizophilum commune, the split gill, that have 23,000 mating types. So fungi are by definition often very non-binary because there's a lot of variation. And that's cool because Schizophilum commune is one of the most widespread mushrooms on the planet, and it gets the power of that adaptability from having all these different kinds of mating types and ability to sort of swap these gene cassettes around and adapt to new habitats. So can I get a slide change? There's sort of the breakdown of the different what are called ecological guilds or trophic modes, ways that fungi eat. So basically you have mutualism. All of this is considered symbiosis even when it's negative, but mutualism is stuff like mycorrhizal fungi, lichenized fungi, the ones that live in the digestive tracts of animals. For parasitic fungi, you have both necrotrophs and biotrophs. So necrotrophs is when the host dies. Something like a cordyceps that kills its host is necrotrophic. Something like a biotroph can live on the host and probably affect its fitness, but doesn't necessarily kill the host. In theory, all mycorrhizal relationships were biotrophic, were some sort of parasitic relationship that over time became more mutualistic, because it doesn't behoove you to kill your host. If your host is where you live, you don't want to kill it because then you've just killed your home. So over time, parasitic relationships tend to get less and less parasitic and potentially more mutualistic. There's a great example of these biotrophs. They're called beetle hangers. These are basically little fungal STDs that beetles get. So beetles do the nasty, and then they get these kind of little things that just grow on the outside of them. It's like genital warts for beetles. Here's that Malassezia yeast I was talking about. So that lives all over our skin, but it can also become problematic. And there's a lot of examples of stuff that have these multiple modes, right? Where in one situation it might be good, and then it will become parasitic. If there's an imbalance in our skin microbiome or something changes the pH, or start using a new shampoo or something, suddenly this flares up. You have stuff like xylaria, which are living inside of plants as an endophyte and probably helping the plant ultimately, but then when the plant dies, it becomes saprotrophic and starts decaying it. And then you have stuff like honey mushrooms, which can be a parasite and kill a tree, and then once they kill the tree, they eat it. So within this, there's a lot of switching of these different metabolic modes, because fungi are ultimately very opportunistic, and they're not going to do what we want them to do, they're going to do what they want to do, which is a great example when you start thinking about forestry or fermentation or anything where you're working with fungi. They're going to do what's best for them, but not necessarily what's best for us. So that's where you learn management strategies. There's also white rot fungi I mentioned, so those are the ones that digest lignin, and that leaves the shredded texture. That's stuff like lion's mane, wine caps, oyster mushrooms. Brown rot fungi tend to be more common on conifers rather than hardwoods, and they leave this kind of cubicle rot, and that's stuff like maitake, chicken of the woods, beefsteak, and Darius polypore, all examples of brown rot fungi. Can I get a slide change? Okay, so who's heard mycelium is the internet of nature before? Yeah, I push back super hard on that concept. It's a good gateway concept, but it really fails to describe the complexity of these different kinds of relationships. You guys may think that there's this sort of underground mycorrhizal community that's a big like hippie kumbaya commune. Everybody's like sharing nutrients and it's like, oh, it's a little tree, let's send it some food. No, it doesn't work like that. Maybe in forests where all of the trees are related to each other and are literally like genetic clones, you'll see nutrients moving around like that, and that's what there has been evidence for, is in like giant tree forests that are all the same thing. You can watch stuff moving around. But when you have mixed forests, especially like we have here in Maine, you have hickories and oaks and elm and ash and all these different tree types, they're all different, and they all are going to have different makeups of the kinds of fungi that are associated with them. And this presents this idea of the sort of mycelium marketplace. And this was proposed by Toby Kears, who, you guys know Merlin Sheldrake and Entangled Life? So Toby Kears is Merlin's postdoc advisor. He's working for her. And so I had written what I thought was kind of critical take on mycelium and mycorrhizal relationships. I sent it to Toby, and she's like, Gordon, this is not good. I can't comment on this. So I was like, all right, the number one mycelial like researcher in the world just told me to like do better. So I went and read some more and did better. And she came back and was like, yes, okay, I'm happy to like write something for you and let's do this. But I sort of reformed my model to make it a lot more complex. And that was really the idea that fungi are working with trees to try to figure out what's going to work best. So if every one of us in this room went to a financial advisor and we say, hey, please set me up with some stocks, they're going to give all of us different stock evaluations because we have different needs in life, right? Depending on your age, your financial situation, stuff like that, you'll create a different portfolio of stuff that fits your needs. So think about a tree that's like up on a ridgeline versus one that's like down in a valley. The one on the ridgeline is going to get way more wind and it's probably a lot more water stressed. So it really needs something that can help it like dig into the soil and absorb all the nutrients and all the water it can get. Whereas the one down in the valley might have all the water and nutrients it can get, but it needs to grow really fast and tall to outcompete the trees around it. So those two trees, even though they're the same species, are going to stack different fungi because they have different needs. The fungi are also looking at the tree saying, hey, what can you do for me? If you're only going to offer me 0.5% of the carbon that you produce, why am I going to waste time on you? But if you're going to offer me like 5 to 10% of the carbon, now we're talking. Now I want to work with you. So there are low risk, low reward mushrooms and high risk, high reward mushrooms. So an example of this would be like Russula or Lactarius are very low risk, very low reward. So a lot of trees have Russula and Lactarius associated with them because it's a low carrying cost. It's like carrying penny stocks. There's not a lot of risk in it. Something like a porcini is a high risk, high reward. That can take 5, 10% of the carbon that the tree is producing, but that porcini can go out and hunt nitrogen for you. So in the Pacific Northwest, you have a lot of trees that are like 500 feet back from the stream bank, and the porcini will be associated with those trees, and they'll grow mycelium all the way out to the bank and absorb nitrogen from the decaying salmon on the banks of that river kind of thing. And so that's, you don't do that unless you have a significant need. But if you think about that, then you're like, wow, is there a reason that this particular tree has this mushroom versus like the same tree a couple hundred feet away has a different set of mushrooms on it? And that's very much this idea that there is this exchange and marketplace going on. There's a lot of communication. And really, it's just more complicated than saying mycelium is the internet of nature. There's also a lot of stuff with the fact that like if you take mycelium away, nutrients will still move through soil even without mycelium there. So it's really hard experimentally to like define what is movement of nutrients in soil. And there just needs to be better methods for it. That's part of what these reviews are about. Can I get a slide change? Okay, climate change is happening. It sucks. Let's change slides. But one of the things, we don't really need to like harp on it. We know the world's going to shit, but so here's one of the things I like to think was like, how can fungi help us be sort of more sustainable? What can we do? They make really good food. They have very low land usage, very low electricity usage, and very, very low water usage. So growing mushrooms is an incredibly sustainable food source. There was a question in the last talk about like the nutritional content of mushrooms, and they're all relatively similar to each other. If you look at the macros, there's a few papers out there that have just like all these sort of nutritional facts listed for 100 grams of dried mushrooms kind of thing. And I put a little diagram in the book just because it looks cool, but they're all relatively similar. And then you guys might have heard the medicinal benefits of mushrooms, right? Lots of people love to talk about, medicinal mushrooms. Someone out there has a tendency to sort of say that they cure cancer, which is a little bit of an overstatement because he then offers to sell you the mushroom that quote unquote cures the cancer. And that I find a little disingenuous because that person's mother was cured of cancer by a drug produced by fungi. They took some turkey tail mycelium powder along with their chemotherapeutic agent, and that's a good thing to do. If you have cancer, absolutely take some medicinal mushrooms. It'll help support a healthy immune system. But the actual chemotherapeutic agent that was killing the cancer cells is a fungal-derived drug called Taxol that was derived from Pacific yew trees, and the fungal endophytes that lived inside the Pacific yew trees are the ones that are actually producing that molecule. So I think instead of sort of looking at medicinal mushrooms as this silver bullet, it's really important to say, these are supportive potentially of good health, but we have a bunch of really important therapies and drugs that we have isolated from fungi. We have stuff like penicillin, which saved literally millions of lives in the last century. We have statins. If you know anyone taking statins for high blood pressure, those were isolated from Aspergillus, which is a mold. Aspergillus oryzae is the same mold that makes like miso and soy sauce. And then if you know anyone who has an organ transplant, they're probably taking cyclosporin, which was originally isolated from Tolipocladium, which is a little cordyceps-like fungus that infects truffles underground, Elaphomyces truffles, which are not the ones that we eat, but also a truffle. So these are all like real medicines and therapies derived from fungi, as opposed to sort of like the wishy-washy, like take some reishi and you'll feel better kind of thing. So I think there's potential for medicinal mushrooms, and I talk about them in the book, but I'm also relatively skeptical of a lot of the marketing that's out there, especially for stuff like lion's mane. It's not going to cure your ADHD or make your memory better. I think the biggest benefit of most mushrooms is just the fiber that's in them, because it's really good prebiotic fiber, and none of us are getting enough fiber. So eat more mushrooms and you will feel better. Can I get a slide change? Okay, so a lot of the questions out there I get are like, well, what does this mushroom do for me? And I'm like, it doesn't have to do anything for you to be important. Mushrooms deserve to just be organisms in the world and exist. And what we should be doing, instead of constantly asking like, what can mushrooms do for me? We say, what can we do for mushrooms, right? So that's the issues that are affecting mushrooms and the commonality of certain species are bigger than us. It's not like somehow like big companies convinced us that recycling was at the level of the individual. It's not. Recycling is a thing that's like way bigger than any one of us. And just because you didn't throw away your can doesn't mean that like the world is dying because of you. There are really big issues in climate change, land degradation, development, flooding, pollution, wildfire. All these things are sort of happening, and there's direct effects and indirect effects. But these are like much larger problems than any one of us can individually tackle. That doesn't mean that we can't be like leaders and stewards in our community. And I talk about how to sort of do environmental stewardship in the book, but don't feel bad because you went out and picked some chanterelles. You're not the one causing global warming. You might not want to pick all of the chanterelles, and I do talk about like the ethics of foraging and what to leave behind kind of thing. And even, Alan mentioned like taking a little piece of a mushroom and like spreading around the woods. You can help be an active proliferator of good things in your environment. But there's bigger issues at play here that are sort of at the level of like governments and countries and corporations, and they're who we should be holding responsible for the future of fungi, rather than like complaining that someone picked tuning morels online kind of thing. One of the things we can do actively is think about bioremediation, but it's not as easy as just taking a big bag of oyster mycelium and throwing it in an oil spill. That doesn't work. You can get mycelium to eat a little bit of oil in a lab, but if you put it out in nature, I talked about fungi being opportunistic and doing what they want to do. If you put that oyster mycelium on oil in nature, they're like, screw this, I'm gonna go eat some wood over here because that's what I'm keyed in to do. So the way to do microremediation or bioremediation in general is go to an infected, contaminated site, isolate the organisms there that are growing, bring them back to a lab, do some isolation, do some screening, do some optimization, and then potentially reintroduce those organisms back to the environment in a slightly more like optimized form, or produce a lot of them. And recognize that this may not be a single step, but this might just be putting fungi there to sort of do that first digestion step that then allows a big succession of other organisms, bacteria, archaea, small animals and stuff, to eventually turn that pollution back into healthy soils. But it may take time, and it's not sort of as easy as just like, oh, I'll throw some mycelium on it. Another big one that we can do is big scale government conservation. And if you guys are familiar with the Fungi Foundation, or specifically the work of Juliana Furci, she is an amazing mycologist down in Chile, and she's put forth this 3F initiative. And the idea is that you all know flora and fauna, but she's trying to add the word funga to conservation wording around the world, basically. It's a top-down approach. Instead of sitting at the bottom saying, like, save our mushrooms, she's going to governments and saying, hey, add the word funga to your conservation, legislation, and then that gives a lot more power. Because if someone's trying to go build like a new shopping mall, we say, oh, you have to go look at the plants and the animals. Sure. But if they don't find any plants or animals that are special, they can just mow down that whole thing and put up a new shopping mall. But if we say, hey, you also have to check the fungi, and they find a rare fungi there, or say maybe like the state mushroom, you say, hey, maybe we should not mow down this whole forest because our state mushroom grows here. So it's another thing to look at, and adding that word funga to high-level stuff can help do a lot to help for the cause for conservation of fungi. Can I get a slide change? Okay, and then this is thinking about how fungi can really assist in every possible aspect of like making our lives more sustainable. Pretty much every single human endeavor has been optimized for the production of lots of stuff, but we have tremendous amounts of waste. That's why there's a giant pile of plastic in the Pacific Ocean. That's why there's landfills all over the place of things that aren't necessarily breaking down, because while nature is very good at sort of having a cyclical thing that uses up every last little bit of nutrients, humans are not good at this. We just create tons and tons of waste and are sort of sliding into exponential decay. But if we start adopting fungi as part of this process, we can start to see all of the ways that they can help us make, food, medicine, materials. How many of you guys know that every single laundry detergent is full of enzymes from fungi? Do you guys know that? That's been going on for like 50 plus years. Most people aren't aware that like the things that says like degreaser or like stain remover, those are all fungal derived enzymes. They grow them up in big vats, they isolate them out, and they stick them in the detergent. So we've been doing that kind of thing for a long time. Clearly, fungi are going to be able to help us with agriculture, horticulture. If we do a better job of integrating them, you get improved crop yields, better soil quality. You don't have to fertilize as much. You can even use them as like better controls to like help control the insect populations. And then for energy, we have tons and tons of plant material, and guess what fungi are really good at doing? Breaking down plant material. They can also produce oils, and so we can use them to make biofuel, biochar, other types of energy. And so this whole sort of like, this is called the mushroom circular economy, and that is the idea that like every endeavor we have can essentially be improved by integrating some form of fungi. So that's sort of, this is the first half of the book, and this is all like quick summary and all the stuff that's in there. Can I get a slide change? Fundamentally though, people are here to talk about mushrooms, so let's talk about mushrooms. What is a mushroom? Does anyone have an answer for me? What do you think a mushroom is? It's a fruiting body, yeah, but what does it do? What's the purpose?
Release spores?
Yeah, the whole point of a mushroom is to release spores. And the reason we have so many different kinds of mushrooms is all about how they release spores. So every new kind of mushroom is essentially like creating some new innovation for like, oh, there's a new way of I'm going to put spores out into the world, whether we're talking like a guild mushroom or a jelly mushroom or a puffball or those ink caps that melt. There's all these different methods for spore dispersal. And that's, at its essence, that's what a mushroom does, right? When people say, what does this mushroom do? I'm like, well, it makes spores. And they're like, yeah, but does it do anything for me? I'm like, doesn't matter. It makes spores. It does what it's supposed to do, which is reproduce. That's its core purpose. Can I get a slide change? So here's a little, like every single mushroom anatomy figure you'll see is always Amanita muscaria or based on an Amanita, which is great, except that there's not that many mushrooms out there that actually have a vulva and an annulus and warts on the top. So I wanted to present some other looks at different mushroom morphologies as part of this mushroom anatomy thing. So here's a little breakdown of basidios versus ascos, and these are the ones, again, that produce mushrooms. And here's a polypore, here's a little gastroid with the spores inside, cup fungi with the ascus, and the cup is lined with all those little asci. All these things are like little pressure-sensitive squirt guns. So basically, if you have a change in air pressure, they'll build up some oxalic acid in the base of this and then shoot out spores. And that's, if you blow into a cup fungi, about 3 seconds later, you get a big puff of spores. That's what's happening. And then if you've ever looked really closely at the surface of like a cordyceps or a xylaria, you guys ever seen the dead man's finger? Or those like weird black dots on dead trees? I think it's the hypoxylon. So those are called flask fungi. So if this is xylaria cut in half, and then these are the little flasks. So all those things are called parathecia, and every single little dot is essentially a little flask with the ability to like release spores. And often with these ascos, you'll see them, initially they'll make asexual spores, and they'll be covered in white conidia. And then later in the year, they'll turn black and hard, and they're putting out sexual spores from these things. And that's a really common strategy that a lot of ascos use. So can I get a slide change? Okay, this is page 145 in my book, and I think it might be sort of the most important page because this is where I lay out the different mushroom morphologies. So morphology is a way of looking at stuff that everything you're sort of basing on the way it looks. This traditional way we've done science, right? We're observational. You could go out and find things that look similar, they must be related. Turns out, now that we've done a bunch of genetic sequencing, not everything that looks similar is related. For example, hedgehog mushrooms and lion's mane both have teeth, but they're not related. Hedgehogs are actually related to chanterelles, and lion's mane is more related to like russula and brittlegill mushrooms, and it is related to a hedgehog. And that's an example of what's called convergent evolutions. Things come together converging on the same form and function because it's useful. Not all guild mushrooms are related. They're coming from a lot of different genetic backgrounds. But from the standpoint of going out into the woods and looking at stuff, being able to quickly bin them like this is really useful. So that's why I have these morphological categories. In my book, on the inside cover, I've never had a whole lot of luck using a dichotomous key. So if anyone's ever seen All the Rain Promises and More, which is sort of like the standard pocket guide that everybody buys, that has a dichotomous key, which looks sort of like this in that you're making these like decisions back and forth about like, yes, no, is it above ground, below ground, or you an Asco Basidio? This one's a little bit better, and so I used this scheme. But one of the things I did on the inside cover was to contrast the morphology, I added a whole taxonomic table. I don't know of any other book out there that has an up-to-date fungal taxonomic table. It's very small print, but it's all there. So if you want to get super nerdy, you can go in and compare how things are different, the morphological categories versus like their taxonomic genetic categories. You don't have to, but you can. Can I get a slide change? Okay, so mushrooms grow everywhere. They're really neat. You can grow on the ground. They can grow on wood. They can grow on other mushrooms. You guys ever seen these powder tops? They grow out here. They're on top of like dead rustlers. There's like a weird powdery thing you find on top of dead rustlers. They grow on insects like cordyceps. They can grow in tropical climates. And mushrooms that grow in tropical climates tend to be smaller and more brightly colored because it's really warm. And the ones that grow in cooler climates tend to be larger and darker colors because it helps them absorb like the energy, the heat from the sun. Anyone ever seen Flammula teeps out during winter? Or brick-cap mushrooms? Those are things I've seen in like Massachusetts in December. So they're out there. You can get cold mushrooms. You get mushrooms forming in the desert. These are called desert truffles. They're about the size of a potato. And I didn't know about these until I was live streaming one day and someone came on from Saudi Arabia and they're like, do you know about these things? And I was like, I've never heard of them. So I looked up and lo and behold, there's like giant truffles that grow in the deserts of the Middle East. And there's people working to cultivate these, which I think is really cool because I would totally want to eat these. They're not super truffly, but they are sort of like sweet and potatoey and really crunchy, I guess. And I was talking about this recently and someone just told me that they found these in Arizona, which is wild because I thought this was something that only grew in like the Middle East, and it turns out that we potentially have a species here in North America. And I'm going to Arizona later this summer, so I hope I get to eat one. There's even a mushroom that grows underwater. It's called Satharella aquatica, and this was found in the Rogue River back in, I think, 2009, 2007, something like that. And it was a big find for science. People were really excited because they found a few little small Asco cups underwater, but not any guild mushrooms. So I was talking about this down in San Diego a couple years ago, and someone was like, hey, we just found one of these in a river in LA. It was a really wet year. And I was like, oh my God, okay, so that extends the range of this mushroom like really far south, all the way from Oregon down to Southern California. And I gave this talk in Pennsylvania last summer, and someone out there was like, hey, we just found a version of this in our river here. And I was like, wow, maybe this mushroom actually grows all over the country. We just don't look for it because no one's looking underwater for mushrooms. But it's just kind of one of those crazy things. It's like often mushrooms occur everywhere, but there's, people know what's in the woods because we go mushroom hunting in the woods, but you don't necessarily go mushroom hunting in a creek or, in other unusual environments. So just a thing to think about. Can I get a slide change? Okay, so a lot of cool ways that mushrooms grow. There are fairy rings, and I hate to tell you, but this is not a portal to like the Fey dimension. There's no other realm on the other side of this. It is just a big patch of mycelium with stuff that they've sort of consumed in the middle, and then they're pushing outwards to spread more spores. And often in the middle of a fairy ring, you'll actually see like a little bit of extra green grass, because that's where the mycelium has started dying and then returning the nutrients to the soil. You have gravitropism, which is where this was a log with some turkey tail on it, and the turkey tail was growing down, always facing down, and then you flip the log, and all the new growth is now perpendicular, so the spores are going to drop down with gravity, because mushrooms are really good at sensing gravity. At one point, they grew some enoki mushrooms in space, like in 0G, and they just went all wonky, all like twisty and all over the place, because there was nothing showing them where down was. So I just told you that mushrooms will always orient down and the gills will face down. Rose combing is an example where the gills are facing up. And this happens a lot on like chanterelles and hedgehogs and mushrooms that tend to grow for a long time. So you're like, wait, but gravity's down. And it's like, yeah, but I'm growing my gills upwards. And what are you doing? And then in really extreme examples, you actually get like a double-decker mushroom, and you'll see like a mushroom on a mushroom kind of thing. I don't think I've seen a three-tiered thing, a mushroom on a mushroom on a mushroom, but I've definitely seen a lot of like two-tiered things. I mentioned honey mushrooms. So honey mushrooms use weaponized mycelium called rhizomorphs to go out and kill trees. So this is sort of like the evil cousin of mycelium, but it's fortified with a lot of melanin, so it can survive above ground. Most mycelium is sort of like little white hairs that would just like get torched by the sun. But this stuff is really hardcore. If you see a dead tree around here, it'll likely have a sort of black webbing around it, and that means Armillaria rhizomorphs got up in between the bark and like the living tissue, and they girdled the tree, and then they ate the tree, and they're off to like go do it again. So rhizomorphs are pretty cool. Anyone recognize this? Chaga. Is it chaga a mushroom? No, it's not. Yeah, good trick question. No one went for the bait. Chaga is a sterile conch. And sclerotia in general are basically like, think of it like a mushroom potato. It's like a tuber where instead of producing a mushroom, it's storing a lot of energy in the form of carbohydrates and oils and then protecting itself with melanin. So in the case of chaga, this can grow for like 80 years on a birch tree. And then when the birch tree finally dies, the chaga mushroom will form. It's sort of a crusty thing that's like along a birch tree. They're super rare, but they do exist. There's a lot of other mushrooms that form sclerotia as well. Morels have to form sclerotia to actually form a fruiting body. So that's a really important thing. Getting morels to form sclerotia is part of the challenge of trying to cultivate them commercially. And I just was reading the other day about, you guys know the umbrella polypore? You ever heard of that one? It's like a weird, uncommon polypore that grows around here. But it's growing out of a sclerotia, and that sclerotia is actually feeding off exudate from honey mushrooms. So you usually find the umbrella polypore on a tree that's been killed by a honey mushroom. So there's all these kind of weird interactions that are happening. There's also something called like a stonebreaker mushroom down in Australia that like after a fire moves through, there's a big tuber sclerotia underground, and that will start growing up mushrooms like crazy right after a fire. And then there's a whole bunch of super tiny mushrooms. They're, endless amounts of super tiny things. And where you draw the line between like a mold and a mushroom is a little like sketchy, but there's lots and lots of tiny ascocups as well as tons of little tiny basidios. There's not that many really massive mushrooms, but there are a few. This one's called Microcybe titans, and this is not like a doctored photo. He's not that tall a guy. He's like 5'5" or something like that, but that is a very large mushroom. And the cool thing about these grow in like subtropical habitats. So this was in Mexico, but these grow in Florida. They grow in like Thailand, so that whole band around the world. And these are edible. And I watched a video of a guy in Thailand who was just gleefully picking a huge patch of these and frying them. He made fried mushrooms for like 200 people in his village. So I'm like, who do we need to talk to get these things cultivated? Because would you not want to go home to the farmer's market with like a nice little umbrella mushroom? I think that'd be pretty cool. Can I get a slide change? Okay, I have never been so afraid for a group of adults as when I'm out on a foray and every single question I get is this edible? And I'm like, hey, wait, slow down, like don't put that in your mouth, please. It's, adults acting like toddlers around mushrooms. And I think it manifests that people are really excited and they just want to know, can I eat this? And usually what I say is, the better question to ask is just, what is this? Because if you can define what something is, then you can go ahead and look it up yourself. But what I've started doing is the current, nomenclature for talking about edibility is really confusing because we usually have choice and edible, and that's confusing. I was at a talk with David Aurora like a month ago from my home club Soma, where he said, who writes like that? And this was David Aurora who literally created that nomenclature, but he was just like, that's such a silly word. Who uses choice to describe something that you want to eat? He's like, if I ever update my book, I'm going to change it. And I was like, well, good, David. I changed it here. I made a 5-star system. So I said, I think people inherently understand like a 5-star rating system. 5 stars, incredible. 4 is great. 3 is good. 2 is fair, mediocre. And 1 star is sort of like non-toxic / technically edible. So now when I do forays, I explain this rating system. And when people come up to me with something like on a stick and say, can I eat this? I'm like, well, that's a 1 star. So it's, it's not going to be palatable. It's probably maybe a little bit bitter and it'd be kind of hard to chew, but you can eat it if you really want to. The definition of edible is suitable to be eaten. So instead of trying to argue with people about what's suitable to eat or not, I just say, well, it's a 1 star. Or in a lot of cases, I'll say that might be a special preparation or even a medicinal. I don't know if anyone here has ever tried to eat A turkey tail or like a Ganoderma, it's hard. You could chew on that thing for hours and you're not gonna get anywhere. You can cook it down for hours and it's still gonna be too tough to eat. But you can cook it down and then dry it and powder it, and that's a special preparation. You can also take something like Amanita muscaria, which is both edible, toxic, and trippy all at the same time, and you can double boil that and make that edible. So that's another way you can sort of specially prepare stuff. Here is an example of what's called the winter trio in California. So if you ever get really sad during winter, fly to California because we can hunt mushrooms all winter long. And we are hunting the black trumpets, the yellowfeet, and the hedgehogs out on the Sonoma-Mendocino coast. You'll also find candy caps in abundance, which are amazing when dried out because they smell like maple syrup. And I love those. So here's my ratings for these. Can I get a slide change? And I love foraging because it does connect you to the seasons. So these are all California mushrooms, but in the spring I'm hunting morels. In the summer I can go up to Humboldt and hunt chanterelles and lobster mushrooms. In the fall, when we get some rain, I'll go out and hunt a bunch of porcini. And our porcini are very large because on the West Coast we have really distinct wet and dry seasons, but it doesn't get so cold that the mycelium goes inactive. So the mycelium is growing all year long, and when we finally do get some moisture, it really goes wild and sucks all the nutrients out and produces these really big mushrooms. So there's a lot more diversity out here on the East Coast, but there's larger mushrooms on the West Coast with less diversity. And then in the winter, there's the yellowfeet, the black trumpets, the hedgehogs, which are similar mushrooms that grow out here. They're just growing at a different time of year. And we also get stuff like matsutake, pig's ear, little jelly mushrooms. Can I get a slide change? And there's a lot of contention around foraging mushrooms, and the big one is simply like your method of harvesting, whether it's cut or pick. And the only real study that's been done on this, there was like a 30-year study with another 14-year study that was done. One was done in Switzerland, the other one was done in Norway. And basically what they showed was over this like 30-year period, there was no significant difference between plots where they were cutting versus picking versus not harvesting. The only thing they really did see a difference on was that the plots that got too much foot traffic had less fruiting bodies. Didn't change the diversity of mushrooms, but it did mean that if you're walking on the soil too much, you're compacting the soil, you're making it harder for mushrooms to come up. Which for me is a really big deal because there's places in California where like there's only 3 parks we're allowed to go hunt at, so everybody goes to those parks. So they're getting way too much foot traffic and it's compacting the soils. And if they would take away that prohibition, then people could hunt all over the place and you would get less pressure put on these one particular parks that you can hunt at. And I think there's always a time to say, like, if you have a polypore, you may not want to rip the whole thing out of the woods. It's a good time to like cut some of the mushroom off. If you have a giant cluster and you want to let the little ones get bigger, cut a mushroom off. But for me, when I'm harvesting stuff like chanterelles and porcini, a lot of the edible stem is underground. So I like to pick it and then kind of trim off that stuff. And there's also a theory that if you cut a mushroom, that mycelium, the base there is going to be prone to infection. And you can see a reduction in at least chanterelles they saw when people were cutting. You had less chanterelles as a result of cutting. So I don't think that like cutting or picking is better or worse, but I think that people should be like nicer to each other about it on the internet because I've gotten a lot of death threats about this, like a disturbing amount. Can I get a slide change? Okay, so here's just a bunch of good like edible mushrooms. Hopefully you guys recognize most of these categories, even if these are mostly West Coast species. This is Cantharellus californicus. This is a state mushroom of California. This is Boletus edulis, grand edulis, that grows with our pine, but similar mushrooms are out here. Butter boletes, Batira boletus, are some of my absolute favorite edible mushrooms. There's lobster mushrooms, which is like a base species of Russula that gets infected by the Ascomycete mold, Hypomyces lactiflorum. And there's a few others, like a green lobster and another few types of lobsters. Most of them, the ones that are growing on Russula and Lactarius tend to be edible. There's some other ones that parasitize boletes that make them really bitter and toxic, and ones that grows on morel that's sort of a white powder, and that's also toxic. You have lion's mane, Hericium erinaceus, and there's a whole bunch of delicious Hericium relatives. Chicken of the woods, this is Latiparus gilbertsonii, which is our West Coast version, and it kind of sucks. I don't love it. You guys have Cincinnatus and Sulphuris out here, which is way better. Cincinnatus is one of my favorite edible mushrooms, but I gave this like a 3-star in my book. It doesn't deserve anything better. It's, especially when it grows in eucalyptus, it's kind of sour. It's okay, but it's not my favorite. Cauliflower mushroom is an elite culinary mushroom. This is really, really tasty. You can break it up and use it as sort of like a pasta substitute. It's like crunchy and cartilaginous, and it's great in salads. And then black and blonde morels. So on the West Coast, we tend to get more black morels, and they tend to be associated with conifers in burns at high elevation. And in the Midwest and the West Coast, you get more of these blonde morels that are associated with like dying trees, but they're always disturbance associated to some degree. Can I get a slide change? Okay, so cooking and cleaning mushrooms can be kind of contentious. A lot of people say that you should like only brush or maybe wipe a mushroom, and that's very silly because mushrooms get rained on all the time in nature. They're fine getting wet. And I find that for stuff like a porcini, like a fairly large mushroom, I can wash it and just scrub off the dirt, but something like a black trumpet or a morel is very highly textural, and it's really better if you soak it. And so you can just kind of soak it until the water runs clear. And there's a few different ways. I always like to clean and prep my mushrooms. Very few mushrooms you can do sort of a carpaccio prep on. So boletes, beefsteak mushroom, a couple amanitas, you can do sort of a raw prep where you marinate them. But a lot of stuff I'll do what's called a dry saute. So you cook it in a pan without oil or butter, and you just cook all the water out. So you kind of squeeze the sponge before you add a whole bunch of fat. And if you add wet mushrooms to fat in a pan, you're never going to get crispy. You're always going to have these sort of wet, insipid mushrooms. And so that dry saute is really important when you're doing especially wild mushrooms. If you have cultivated mushrooms like shiitake, oyster mushrooms, and they're kind of dry, instead of doing a dry saute, you can actually add some water to the pan, do what's called a wet saute. So you just sort of steam them, cook the water off, then go ahead and add your oil and butter. Same theory, but you're just adding a little more water. And then if people don't like the slippery texture of mushrooms, you can always just bread them and fry them, because that's delicious. Can I get a slide change? So I did a whole chapter on like edible mushrooms and how to cook and eat mushrooms, the practice of mycophagy. And so here's a whole bunch of other kind of cooking methods you can use. And one of the things I love to do with mushrooms is combine different cooking methods. We do this all the time for meat. It would not be that weird to like grill something and then fry it, or like, you see fancy restaurants especially, they'll like sous vide something and then they'll finish it under the broiler. And you can do the same thing with mushrooms. If you put the same amount of like care and attention into seasoning and cooking your mushrooms, it's gonna yield a fantastic product. There's also a lot of really cool ways to preserve them. So drying is pretty standard. For a lot of mushrooms, I end up cooking and freezing them. And if you're going to do that, it's also really helpful to not add a lot of oil to them, because the oil will oxidize and go rancid over time. I've used mushrooms that are 3-4 years old, and they're not freezer burned, especially if you put them in like a stew or a pasta where you have a lot of flavor. They don't taste freezer burned at all, unlike meat, which gets freezer burned after like a month. And especially if you put a lot of oil and butter in them, they will taste a little rancid, because that's what absorbs that rancid flavor. But if you just boil them and then freeze them in a bag, they'll last almost indefinitely. I also really like doing syrups and candies with a lot of mushrooms, which is not usually what you think about, but it's a really cool way to just boil stuff down in sugar. Then you can keep it in a jar and like take it out and put it on top of desserts or in baked goods. Liquid infusions is really cool too. I put a lot of stuff in booze and then like come back to see the flavor later. It's really fun. Conserva is kind of a quick pickle kind of thing. I do that, like boil mushrooms real quick, then melt them with some vinegar and then cover it in oil and just pop it in the fridge with some herbs. Awesome. Can I get a slide change? Okay, so here's the big fear when you're doing edible mushrooms is, well, what about poisonous ones? And what I want to point out to you here is that other than Amanita muscaria, which I talked about as being both edible, trippy, and toxic, most of these things are fairly drab. A lot of poisonous mushrooms are not going to advertise to you that they are poisonous, unlike animals and plants, where brightly colored things tend to be poisonous. Fungi are different. So this is a destroying angel. This is the West Coast version. This Phalloides is also out here. Phalloides is a European species that's actively spreading invasively around North America, especially in California. It's displacing a lot of our native amanitas. But Galerina and Phalloides and Ocreata all have amatoxins. So these are little circular peptides that are heat stable, so you can't make them safe by cooking them. Whereas muscaria, you can double boil this and dilute the toxins out, because this is ibotenic acid and muscimol, which are not deadly toxins for the most part. Ibotenic acid can cause some pretty severe GI distress, and if you eat way too much of it, it can like poke holes in your brain. But for the most part, people don't die from eating Amanita muscaria. They do die from eating death caps and destroying angels, though. These cannot be detoxified, so there's no safe way to process these, and that's why it really pays to like know what types of amanitas you're working with. Roll rims cause sort of a weird like autoimmune blood allergy if you eat them, and you can just like drop dead, so don't eat roll rims. The West Coast jack-o'-lantern looks a little different from what you guys have. Yours is a little brighter orange, but either way, that's not a good one to eat. That will make you fairly sick fairly quickly, and you definitely want to avoid eating those, although they glow bioluminescently at dark, which is really cool to see them glow green, and you can even dye fabrics with them. So they're cool mushrooms even if you don't want to eat them. You do want to make sure you know the difference between like Omphalotus and chanterelles, and I have a page about that in my book that helps you tell the difference. And I hate the name false morel. In the book, they're called lorchels. That was like an old German name for these Gyrometra. But these contain a compound called monomethylhydrazine that can be a pretty potent neurotoxin. In theory, it cooks off, so you can like boil these and then cook the toxin off, but I don't recommend that. There are some Gyrometra like Kaufmannii and Montana that don't have that toxin and are fine to eat, but it's good to know the ones you want to avoid. And then out here, you actually have a few more toxic boletes, but out west, we really only have Satan's bolete, and this is the one that can poison you from eating it. Otherwise, pretty much all boletes in the west coast are safe to eat. Out here, I think you have Exudoporus and like Boletus hurinensis. There's a couple that are toxic, but still most boletes out here are edible. There's not that many that are really a big issue. Can I get a slide change? So here's, in the book, I have a whole, in the last talk, Alan's talk, someone was asking about different types of toxins. So you can't read this super well, but there's a whole table on like all the different types of toxins that are in mushrooms, and there's tremendous diversity of them. So I was doing my best to try to like lump things into like general categories, but can I get a slide change? Okay, and the assumption, right, is that poisonous mushrooms are colorful. And no, all those poisonous mushrooms aren't very colorful, and all these very colorful mushrooms aren't very poisonous. And that's a general thing in mushrooms, is that colorful stuff does not equate with its toxicity. But there are a lot of cool pigments and compounds in mushrooms that give them these bright colors. And so all these ones on top are from New Zealand, where I first sort of cut my teeth mushroom hunting. And then these ones in the bottom I found myself. This one is actually from New Hampshire, so you can find these really bright, vibrant hygroscope wax caps here. Can I get a slide change? There's also UV reactive and bioluminescent mushrooms. So fluorescence is when you have a compound in the mushroom or whatever is fluorescing. Generally, you have like two chemical rings that are saturated, and there's something in the middle that the electrons get excited by the light you're shining down. And as those electrons come back down in energy state, they emit light at a different wavelength. So it's light in, light out, and that's the sort of what you see as fluorescence. And that's a general property of a lot of different things in life. Like all plants will glow red because they have chlorophyll. A lot of insects like millipedes and scorpions will glow kind of a bright blue color. But there's a lot of chemistry going on in mushrooms, so you'll see them putting off some pretty cool colors. And a whole diversity from like kind of yellows to oranges to blues to greens, and that just happens when you're shining the light. So there's not any real like biological reason for this fluorescence other than the fact that it contains some kind of compound that is fluorescent, but it's really cool. And having a little UV light allows you to kind of see all this like hidden stuff. I find it really useful for lichens too, because a whole tree will be covered in lichen. It looks like all the same thing, and then you shine UV light on it, and you can see all these different colors and expressions of the lichen because of the UV. So it's kind of, if you've ever been looking for a thing that allows you to see like hidden things in the world, go get yourself a UV flashlight. It's neat. And then there's bioluminescence, which is different because these are actually producing their own light. So this is a similar reaction to what happens in jellyfish. Luciferin, luciferase, chemical catalysis of a thing that produces light. And this is going on all the time at a low level. But you usually can't see it unless it's fully like in the dark and your eyes have adjusted. Out here you have Pinella stypticus, and this is bright enough you can see it with the naked eye, but most of these other ones, these are like Alan's photos, and these are like long exposures that he's done, so you have to set up a camera and let it go for like 5 minutes with a really wide open shutter. Can I get a thing? Okay, so this is guttation. This is my favorite sort of mushroom phenomena, and the book ends with some really cool like growth phenomena type things. And this is particularly prevalent in like polypores and hydnellum. When they're young, they get a lot of this droplets growing, and that's basically just mushroom sweat. They're working so hard, they're growing so fast, they're producing droplets of water, and they're loaded up with polyphenols and tannins that give them these incredible colors. So I think that's just really cool. I took pictures of it. Can I get a slide change? There's a lot of mushrooms that have really interesting aromas, and this isn't a thing that I think most people think about. You look at the morphology, but very rarely do people pick up mushrooms and smell them. And I thought it was really useful as an identification tool, and it's, for me, as someone who's like a wine background, I've spent a lot of time smelling stuff, doing sensory training, so I think it's fascinating, because I can look at a mushroom and be like, I'm not sure what that is, and I can take one little whiff and be like, oh, yep, that's Hebeloma. Like, I know the smell of things because you kind of go around, and even when I don't know the exact species, I can recognize it because of the general aroma of a mushroom. So there's candy caps. These contain a lactone called sotalon. Lactones are things you get from toasting wood, like vanillin, which smells like vanilla. So sotalon smells like maple, and it's literally the same compound that's in maple syrup. It's also in sherry and fenugreek. So when you dry these mushrooms out, you get a really strong maple flavor. There's the Prince, Agaricus augustus, and that has benzaldehyde, which smells like almonds. And there's a whole bunch of almond-scented Agarics that all kind of taste like portobello, except they're almondy. They're really good. There's Matsutake, which is this sort of weird cinnamon seafood floral like chemical note. There's Bluets, which to me smell like freezer burned orange juice concentrate. If you've ever had orange juice from a cafeteria, you know what a Bluet smells like. Out west we have the cedar waxycap, and these smell really like piney and woodsy and terpenic. My friend soaked some in alcohol and they made a gin and tonic with them, and it was like out of bounds good, so that was really cool. They say it smells like Russian leather, whatever that is. There's the blue-green clitospy, and that smells like anise or fennel. Oyster mushrooms have kind of a similar smell. Anyone run into this before, the stinky squid? This is one of the smelliest mushrooms I have ever seen in my life. And it's like this big, and every time I find it, I think I found a dead body. And it grows out here, so this is like a New England specific thing. Pseudocolus, I think, is the genus. But yeah, it stinks. It's real bad. And the point of this is to attract flies. So like I was talking about, these are the things that went underground, that came back above ground, and they're still using animals to spread their spores. So they're covered in this like sticky gleba, which is where the spores are, and so flies and slugs crawl all over it, get covered, and then they go off. And then we have the yellow staining agarics. Dave Aurora calls these the lose your lunch bunch, because if you get this yellow staining, you're gonna puke if you try eating them. Fortunately, these turn really yellow and smell bad when you cook them, so it's not often that you're gonna cook these and then actually consume them. If you don't know what the smell of phenol is, it's like the smell of old Band-Aids, and for anyone born after 1990, that would be the smell of like library paste, a doctor's office, disinfectant, even really peaty scotch has this kind of like phenol element to it. Can I get a slide change? Okay, and then in the book, I created an aroma wheel. So I come from a wine background, and I was at UC Davis where we had a lot of aroma wheels. And so I did a similar thing with mushrooms, and then I sort of binned things in general categories and had much more specific descriptors around the outside. And I have some examples of like different mushrooms and the molecules that are in them that smell different ways. Did I actually successfully change that? No. Okay, there we go, microheterotrophs. So these are plants that, this is the section of my book called Not Fungi, but Still Fascinating, at the very end. So these are plants that have completely lost the ability to do photosynthesis, and they are completely dependent on their ability to draw carbon from the mycelial network. So they're considered parasitic, but as we learn more about them, it turns out that they tend to be like really important cogs in an ecosystem. So like a healthy ecosystem has a lot of these, and they may even assist with like helping that ecosystem recover or changing sort of the soil microbiome within a localized area around the plant. But basically, they don't have any green leaves, and so once a year, they just put out these spectacular colored flowers. Ghost plant is really common around here. You'll see that all over the place. And some people use it to make tinctures, but it also has a bunch of like toxins in it, so maybe not the best idea. I was just hiking the other day with my mom, and I ran into a big pink fairy slipper, pink lady slipper. And orchids are all heterotrophic, microheterotrophic for the beginning of their life. So orchid seeds have absolutely no like germ in them. There's no starch inside. And so once they germinate, they have to recruit a fungi to come help it out, and they'll gain all of their nutrients from these specific orchid mycorrhizal fungi. And this kind of like interaction is really important, especially on like the epiphytic orchids that live in like the canopy in the Amazon. And there's specific fungi out there that associate with those orchids to help them get started. And some of them exist with the fungi for their entire lifetime, and then some of them become photosynthetic and just do,
I think there's a prohibition on like transplanting like such as we find them in the woods. Mm-hmm. And I'm guessing it's probably related to the fact that you actually need.
Yeah, you need the fungus and stuff there. It's really better to leave them where they are, So it's just cool because like these are really spectacular colored plants, but so are orchids, and these also have this like extreme need to partner with fungi. So can I get a slide change? And then there's slime molds. And slime molds are, despite the fact they're called molds, aren't molds at all. They're not mushrooms, and they're not fungi. They're more like an amoeba protist kind of thing. And they start out crawling around as plasmodium. So this is sort of like an amorphous one giant cell that's like crawling and eating stuff. And then eventually they form these distinct sporangia, and there's a lot of different kinds of forms of these that have incredible colors. Eventually they all like turn black or brown and kind of get spored out. But I like these phases where they're really colorful. Can you give me one? I think there's a video that will play here if you go to the next slide. There we go. So this pulsing you're seeing here is called cytoplasmic streaming. So each one of these clips is like 40, 60 minutes of real time. And that pulsing is the plasmodium kind of growing back and forth. But I have a lot more pics or like videos of that on my Instagram if you want to see it. So I think it's pretty cool. It's pretty trippy. Okay, can I get a slide change? I'm going to Mexico in September, beginning of October. As a really cool trip that I'm taking with Zach Mazzi and his partner Kim. They are professional chefs and mushroom hunters that live down in Oaxaca. We're going to Chiapas, and there's going to be a lot of really cool things we're doing together. We're doing like a natural dye textile workshop. We're going to go do some chocolate making. We're going to be eating a lot of like native mushrooms in Mexico and hanging out with Mexican mycologists and doing some community science. I'm really excited about this trip. I think there's a couple spots left. If anyone is interested, you could check out thefungivore.com. Or you can just email me and I will teach you about it. But yeah, this will be a cool trip if anyone wants to go to Mexico. I don't speak enough Spanish to go on my own, so I was like, hey, you guys are going to go, please take me along. And I would love to have some company. So if you're interested, check it out. Can I get a slide change? Okay, so yeah, thank you for listening. If you'd like to see more of me, I'm on all of the different social medias, including some weird ones like Blue Sky, which is like a less racist Twitter. I still have my podcast is still up. I can't record new episodes, but it's on Spotify and YouTube and maybe Apple. So if you liked anything I talk about here, you can hear me ranting for a longer period of time about all these subjects. You can check out my website. I have cool shirts like this one. And I got a Patreon. You can use my code with Norspore. And could you change the slide? Please get a copy of my book, because everything I talked about in this is here in the book explained much better than what I could say in a presentation. So I believe that Norspore bought some, so I think they'll have some. But if not, you can use this QR code to go online, and they should be. It was released by Penguin Random House, so it's a major publication. So it should be in every like major bookstore kind of thing, and hopefully I would encourage you to go to your local independent bookstore and buy it from them. But I'm hoping that they will have it as well. And if they don't, please ask them to order it. Okay, who here has seen Last of Us? Is anyone afraid of becoming a mycelium zombie? Okay, can I get a slide change? Okay, so we're talking about entomopathogenic fungi. These are fungi that specifically infect insects. And that's kind of weird because most fungi are eating plant material, but here's this whole specialized clade of different types of fungi from different genetic backgrounds that target insects specifically. And that's again because fungi co-evolved with everything else. Some things are very specific to an insect host, whereas other things tend to be generalists and will affect lots of different kinds of insects. There's a really interesting relationship that I learned about. There's a thing called Beauvaria, which is just a white mold that grows on lots of different kinds of insects. It's all over the place, and they even use it in agriculture to help control pests. Beauvaria is the anamorphic asexual form of cordyceps. But Beauvaria usually does not form a cordyceps unless it's in a very specific type of insect. So the way that these things work is the Beauvaria is actually present as an endophyte living inside of plants. The insects go to eat the plant, and then they get infected from the inside. This fungus starts taking over their body. Once in a while, when it's the right kind of insect, the fungi within the insect will mate and then form a cordyceps mushroom. But Beauvaria is everywhere, cordyceps aren't. And so that actually says that cordyceps are everywhere, but it's only like the teleomorphic mushroom forming form that is like fairly rare. And that was really mind-blowing to me. And we use various types of entomopathogenic fungi to control insect growth. So this is a thing that's already happening. Right? This is not in theory. There are companies that sell these as sprays. You spray them all over a vineyard or an orchard, and in theory can help knock back the pest pressure. Can I get a slide change? So the big fear that was put out there with Last of Us was specifically from kind of the intro. And if you guys have watched that, it's this very serious looking scientist, which is funny to me because he's an actor. And people keep quoting what he said in the beginning of that show as if it were actual science. I'm like, do you guys not realize that this is fiction? And this man is an actor, not a scientist. Also, I find that there's a lot of fear towards scientists and a lot of distrust when people are like, oh, there's some scientist working in a lab somewhere to turn that disease into a pandemic. And you're like, why do you think the scientists are doing that? There's more likely there's a scientist who's trying to prevent that than actually enabling that. But that is the societal fear. And so hopefully by being a stand-up scientist and a public science communicator, I can help convince people that scientists are relatively normal, usually pretty nerdy, but relatively normal people who also don't wish harm on others. Okay, so this was specifically a slide meant to sort of debunk what was put out at the beginning of Last of Us. If you're not familiar with that, that is a video game that then became a show on HBO where cordyceps has jumped the species barrier from insects into humans and has now very quickly somehow turned like half of the world's population into these like shambling zombie mushroom things. And some of it is based in truth and some of it is just like pure fiction. So increasing global temperatures will lead to more serious pathogenic fungal infections. And that is true. We're watching global temperatures rise as a result of global warming. Human body temperature is currently falling. I don't know why, but for the past century, we've been like human body temperature has been trending downwards, which makes it easier for pathogenic fungi to infect us. And there's stuff like Candida auris, which became really common during the COVID pandemic, and it is wreaking havoc because it's sort of like a superbug. If you guys have heard of like a bacteria that can resist all the different antibiotics, this is a yeast that can infect humans and can resist most of the drugs that we have to fight it. So that is an issue now in hospitals. I also just recently heard about a fungi they found in hospitals that's fairly drug resistant that is degrading plastics, which is really a big fear because a lot of stuff that happens in hospitals is dependent on single-use plastics. You do not want a catheter falling apart inside of someone. That's bad news. So fungi can infect and manipulate their host by producing psychoactive chemicals. That is true. Anyone ever heard of Massospora before? So this is a thing that infects cicadas. And this is actually a zygomycetes fungus. This is one of those non-mushroom forming ones. But cicadas get infected with this, and the whole bottom half of their body rots off and turns into a giant pile of spores, thus massospora, mass of spores. And so it also, at the same time, has grown mycelium through their body. And depending on the cicada and depending on the species of this fungi, it will inject either cathinone, which is a kind of amphetamine, or psilocybin into the brain of that cicada. And what it causes is it's affecting mostly male cicadas, and it causes them to dance around, doing this little like butt wiggle thing. And that signals to the other male cicadas to, hey, come mate with me. So the male cicada's like, yeah, sure thing, baby. It comes down and mates and gets covered in spores, and then it gets infected and goes off infected more. All of those things are true, but what was done in Last of Us is they kind of took all that stuff and made a composite theoretical organism that could do all of those things to humans, which is so far none of this has been proven, And so I will tell you right now, there's no real fear of us turning into shambling mushroom zombies. I am worried about something like Candida auris and the spread of pathogenic fungi as a result of human mixing of stuff all around the world. But the big thing about fungal diseases is they tend to move very slowly, right? We do have drugs to fight them, and they're called azoles, and those are relatively toxic to us, because fungi are similar enough to us that we don't have enough things to fight them off. So we have azoles, but that's really one limited class of drugs that has a fair bit of toxicity to us, so we can't take that much of them. Our body temperature is permissive to fungi. There's a thing in the game that if your body temperature falls before 94 degrees, you just die in the game. So there's a lot of people out there who think that that's true, and it's not. And we have fungi living on our skin and inside of us that exist just fine at our normal body temperature. And in the show, it shows that the fungi are somehow evolving very quickly, and there's a point where a character gets bitten in the leg, and by morning, 12 hours later, she's like a frothing zombie kind of thing. You're like, that's just not, fungi reproduce by spore, not by physical contact most of the time, and it would be a very slow-moving disease. So in that sense, Last of Us is great fiction, but it is just pure sci-fi. So, Scott?
There's been some fungal diseases like Candida that seem to have an increase in abundance.
Yep.
Valley fever is becoming a significant issue in California.
Yes.
Are there other fungal infections that we should be worried about, the pathogens that are happening?
There's a few. Valley fever is the other one I wrote about in the book, and that's one that is a big issue on the West Coast because in really wet years, you have a big spike in rodent and bird populations, and this fungus tends to be in the poop of those things, so it dries out, And then in California, we get these things called the Santa Ana winds that mobilizes huge amounts of dust and blows it around. I believe you were just at a music festival where last year there was like 20 people that got infected with valley fever. It was in the fall, and then they changed the timing of the music festival. I don't think they said this officially, but I was looking at it, I was like, wow, if you had like 20 reported cases of valley fever, there was probably hundreds, and probably a lot of people got really sick but didn't know it. I think of coccicoides, the valley fever, as a really dangerous one because I had a friend in college whose mom got it. She was out gardening, and something got into her. She went to the doctor. They couldn't figure out what was wrong. She ended up getting meningitis, swelling of the brain, sustained brain damage, and died because they didn't know how to treat this fungal disease. Coccicoides is part of a larger order called Onagales. And I told you earlier that fungi really only are breaking down plants. Well, the Onagales have acquired the ability to break down keratin. So they can grow on animals. And there's kinds of Onagales that grow on like horns, and coccicoides is in that group. So if there was an emerging human pathogen that could pose serious risk, it's probably going to come from the Onagales group. And there's other stuff like the split gill I mentioned, actually. That is the only mushroom that's ever been documented to actually form a mushroom in a human. There's a lot of different mushrooms that can cause respiratory issues, but schizophyllum is the only one that can, it's like a fairly aggressive human pathogen if it gets inside of you. I don't think we're going to face a pandemic from those things in particular, but it's kind of hard to say because there is the potential, and fungi have, for better and worse, transformed the entire world because they're just doing what's best for them. So, thank you guys for listening. Please check out my book, Passport to Kindgom Fungi.